The owner pulled the second beer back across the counter before Dean's hand even touched it. And in the half-second of silence that followed, every person in that roadside diner understood exactly what was about to happen, except nobody knew if Dean Martin would stand up and leave or stay and fight. Wait, because what Dean said in the next 10 minutes left the owner in tears and changed that diner forever. And almost nobody realized what it cost Dean to keep his voice that calm. It was late April 1966, and Dean Martin was supposed to be in Birmingham by 8 o'clock that evening for a private performance at a country club benefit. He was running behind schedule, but that was nothing new. Dean had been running behind schedule for most of his adult life, and somehow he always made it work. At 48 years old, he was one of the biggest stars in America. Smooth, unflappable, the kind of man who could make a tuxedo look like pajamas and a microphone sound like a conversation with an old friend. He was driving himself that day, which was unusual. Most of the time, Dean had drivers, assistants, handlers, people whose entire job was to make sure he got from point A to point B without having to think about it. But this trip was different. He'd wanted to drive, wanted the quiet, wanted a few hours where nobody needed anything from him. His regular driver, a man named Marcus Webb, was riding in the passenger seat, navigating with a road map spread across his lap. Marcus was 42, black, and one of the most reliable people Dean had ever worked with. They'd been on the road together for almost 3 years. The car was a silver Lincoln Continental, smooth as silk on the highway but starting to overheat in the Alabama spring humidity. Dean had pulled off Interstate 65 about 20 minutes earlier, looking for a place to let the engine cool down and maybe grab something cold to drink. They'd passed 2 gas stations, both closed, and were now rolling slowly through a stretch of rural highway where the trees grew thick on both sides, and the only signs of civilization were hand-painted advertisements for Coca-Cola and Jesus. That's when they saw Miller's Rest Stop. It wasn't much to look at. A low-slung building with white clapboard siding, a gravel parking lot, and a faded Schlitz beer sign hanging crooked above the door. There were maybe 6 or 7 cars parked outside, dusty sedans and pickup trucks with Alabama plates. And there, in the front window, tucked between a poster for peach pie and a sun-bleached American flag, was a small handwritten sign that read, "Whites only. We reserve the right to refuse service." Marcus saw it first. "Dean, let's keep driving. There's gotta be another place up the road." Dean didn't answer right away. He was staring at that sign, his hands still on the steering wheel, engine idling. The afternoon sun was hitting the windshield at an angle that made everything look washed out and too bright. "I'm thirsty, Marcus." "I know, and that engine's running hot." "We stop here. Let it cool down. Grab a couple of beers. We're back on the road in 20 minutes. Marcus folded the map slowly, carefully. "You see that sign, right?" "I see it." "Then you know they're not going to serve me." Dean turned to look at him, and something in his expression made Marcus stop talking. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was something quieter than that, something that sat deep behind Dean's eyes, like a decision that had already been made before the conversation even started. "They're gonna serve both of us," Dean said. "Or they're not gonna serve either of us." He opened the door and stepped out into the heat. "Notice something here, because this is where the whole thing starts to tilt." Dean Martin could have driven away. He could have found another diner, another rest stop, someplace where the rules were different, or at least better hidden, but he didn't. And if you're wondering why, you need to understand something about Dean Martin that most people didn't see because he was so good at hiding it behind the jokes and the songs and the cool, easy charm. Dean Martin hated bullies. He'd grown up in Steubenville, Ohio, the son of an Italian immigrant barber, and he'd spent his whole childhood watching people get pushed around for talking with an accent, or having the wrong last name, or not having enough money. He'd seen it. He'd lived it. And somewhere along the way he'd made himself a promise that if he ever got big enough, famous enough, powerful enough, he'd never let it slide when he saw it happening to someone else. Marcus followed Dean across the gravel lot, walking a half step behind, the way he'd learned to do in places like this. The door to Miller's Rest Stop had a little bell attached to the top, and when Dean pushed it open, that bell rang out clear and bright, and every head in the place turned to look. Marcus had worked for Dean Martin for almost 3 years, and in all that time he'd never quite figured the man out. Dean could be laughing and joking one minute, then go completely quiet the next, like he'd stepped into a different room inside his own head. Marcus had seen Dean walk away from confrontations that other men would have thrown punches over, and he'd seen Dean dig in his heels over things that seemed too small to matter. The question Marcus could never answer was simple. When Dean Martin decided something was worth fighting for, what made him choose that particular hill to die on? He had a feeling he was about to find out. There were maybe a dozen people inside. Most of them were men, farmers, truck drivers, a couple of guys in work shirts with oil stains on the sleeves. There was one woman, middle-aged, sitting alone at a table near the window with a cup of coffee and a paperback novel. Behind the counter stood a man in his early 50s with thinning gray hair, a white apron, and the kind of face that looked like it had spent too many years scowling into the sun. His name was Earl Miller, and this was his place. He'd inherited it from his father in 1959, and before that, his father had inherited it from his father. 3 generations of Millers, all serving the same menu, all enforcing the same rules. Earl Miller recognized Dean Martin immediately. His eyes went wide for just a second, the way anyone's eyes would go wide if a movie star walked into their diner. And then something else took over, something harder. Dean walked up to the counter like he owned the place, like he'd been coming here his whole life. He smiled that easy Dean Martin smile, the one that had charmed millions of people on television, and in nightclubs, and on movie screens across the country. "Afternoon," Dean said. Earl Miller nodded slowly. "Mr. Martin." His voice was tight, formal. "Hot day," Dean said. "I was hoping I could get a couple of cold beers. You serve Schlitz?" "We do." "Perfect. I'll take 2, please." Earl reached into the cooler behind him and pulled out 2 bottles of Schlitz. He popped the caps off with a bottle opener attached to the counter and set them both down in front of Dean. Condensation was already forming on the glass, little droplets running down the labels. Dean reached for the first one, then gestured to the second. "That one's for my driver. He's right behind me." And that's when Earl Miller's hand shot out and pulled the second beer back across the counter. The silence that followed wasn't loud, but it was total. Every conversation in that diner stopped. The woman with the paperback looked up. A man at the counter turned his head. Somebody's fork clinked against a plate and then went still. Dean's hand was still extended, fingers open, hovering over the spot where the beer had been. Earl Miller's voice was steady, but there was something in it that sounded almost apologetic. "I can serve you, Mr. Martin, but I can't serve him." He nodded toward Marcus, who was standing a few feet back, near the door, his face carefully blank. Dean didn't move. He didn't pull his hand back. He didn't look at Marcus. He just stood there, staring at Earl Miller, with that same easy expression, like they were still having a friendly conversation about the weather. "Why's that?" Dean asked. Earl Miller's jaw tightened. "You saw the sign." "I did. But I'm asking you, why can't you serve him?" "Because that's the rule." "Whose rule?" "My rule. My place, my rules." Dean finally pulled his hand back, but he didn't step away from the counter. Instead, he did something that surprised everyone in that diner. He sat down on one of the stools. Slowly, deliberately, like he was settling in for a long conversation. "You mind if I ask you something, Earl?" Dean's voice was still calm, still friendly. Earl blinked. "How'd you know my name?" Dean nodded toward the embroidered patch on Earl's apron. "Says it right there. Earl Miller. That's your full name, or you got a middle name in there somewhere." "Earl Joseph Miller. Earl Joseph Miller," Dean repeated, like he was tasting the words. "That's a good strong name. Sounds like the kind of name a man could be proud of." Earl didn't say anything. He was standing very still, his hand still resting on the beer bottle he'd pulled back. "Here's what I'm curious about, Earl," Dean continued. "You recognized me when I walked in, right?" "Yes, sir. You've probably seen me on TV. Maybe you've heard some of my records. I've seen you on the Dean Martin show." "My wife likes it." "That's nice to hear," Dean said. And he meant it. "So you know I'm a singer. You know I work with a lot of different people. Musicians, comedians, actors. You know I've worked with Sammy Davis Jr.? Earl's expression shifted slightly. "I know who he is. Sammy's one of my best friends," Dean said. "We've done shows together all over the country. We've had dinner together, traveled together. He's been to my house. I've been to his. You know what Sammy is, Earl? Earl didn't answer. He's black, Dean said simply. And he's one of the most talented people I've ever met. One of the best friends I've ever had. So when you tell me you can't serve my driver because of the color of his skin, I'm trying to understand what rule you're following that says a man like Marcus over there, who's never done anything to you, who you don't even know, doesn't deserve a cold beer on a hot day. Listen to what's happening here. Because this is where Dean Martin does something that nobody expected. He's not yelling. He's not threatening. He's not pulling out his fame like a weapon and demanding special treatment. He's doing something much more dangerous than that. He's asking questions. Earl Miller shifted his weight from one foot to the other. A couple of the men at the tables were watching now, openly staring. The woman with the book had set it down completely. It's not personal, Mr. Martin, Earl said. It's just how things are done. Who taught you that? Dean asked. My daddy. And who taught your daddy? His daddy, I suppose. Dean nodded slowly. 3 generations of Millers. All doing things the same way. Never questioning it. Never wondering if maybe there was a better way. Earl, can I tell you something about my life? Earl didn't object, so Dean kept going. When I was a kid, I worked in a steel mill in Ohio. Dirty work. Hard work. I was 16 years old, and I thought that was going to be my whole life. Punching a clock. Coming home covered in soot. Drinking beer with the same guys every Friday night, until I was too old to lift a hammer. You know what got me out of that? Singing, Earl said. That's right. Singing. But not just singing. It was people. People who saw something in me I didn't see in myself. My first partner was a guy named Joe Bishop. White guy. Older than me. Played piano. He taught me how to read a room. How to work a crowd. Then I worked with a kid named Jerry Lewis. Jewish kid. Funniest person I'd ever met. Then Sammy. Then Frank Sinatra. You know what all those people have in common, Earl? Earl shook his head. They're all different. Different backgrounds. Different religions. Different colors. And every single one of them made my life better. Every single one of them taught me something I needed to know. If I'd followed your rule, if I'd only worked with people who looked like me, I'd still be in that steel mill. I'd have missed out on the best friendships of my life. Dean picked up the beer in front of him and took a slow sip. He set it back down on the counter and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. So here's my question for you, Earl. What are you getting out of this rule? What's it doing for you? Earl's face was red now, and his hands were shaking slightly. It's not about what I get. It's about keeping things the way they're supposed to be. According to who? According to... Earl stopped. He looked around the diner, like he was searching for an answer in the faces of his customers. Nobody was looking at him anymore. They were all looking down at their plates, their coffee cups, anywhere but at the counter. Remember what I said earlier about Dean Martin hating bullies? This is the other side of that coin. Dean wasn't just good at standing up to bullies. He was good at recognizing when someone was acting like a bully because they were scared. And Earl Miller was scared. You could see it in the way his hands trembled, the way his voice kept trying to sound strong but came out thin and uncertain. Dean leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice so only Earl could hear. Let me tell you what I think, Earl. I think you're not a bad man. I think you're a man who's doing what he was taught to do, and you've never stopped to ask yourself if it's right. I think if I walked out of here right now, and never came back, you'd serve the next white customer that walked through that door, and you'd forget this conversation ever happened. But I also think, and I hope I'm right about this, I think there's a part of you that knows this rule is wrong, that knows treating people different because of their skin color is wrong. And I think that part of you has been getting quieter and quieter every year, because it's easier to follow the rule than to change it. Earl's eyes were red. He was breathing hard, his chest rising and falling under that white apron. I got a business to run, Earl said. But there was no force behind it. You do, Dean agreed. And you can run it any way you want. But let me ask you this. 10 years from now, 20 years from now, when you're an old man and you look back on your life, what are you going to be proud of? Are you going to tell your grandkids that you once refused service to a man because of a sign in the window? Or are you going to tell them about the day you decided to be better? Dean reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He took out a $20 bill and placed it on the counter between them. I want to buy lunch for everyone in this diner, Dean said. Black or white, it doesn't matter. I want everyone here to eat together, as equals, as human beings sharing a meal. Earl stared at the 20 like it was something dangerous. I can't take your money, Mr. Martin. Why not? Dean asked. Is it because I'm trying to buy lunch for a black man? I thought money didn't have a color. Earl. A couple of people in the diner actually laughed at that. The tension was starting to crack. Just a little. You could feel it in the room, like ice beginning to thaw. Look closely at what's happening in Earl Miller's face right now, because this is the moment where a man's entire world starts to tilt. His hand is shaking on that $20 bill, and behind his eyes you can see 3 generations of certainty colliding with one simple question he can't answer. Why shouldn't money have a color if people do? And if that doesn't make sense, what else doesn't make sense? Wait, because what happens next is the part that makes this story worth telling. It's the moment when everything Dean's been building toward either works or it doesn't. Earl Miller stood there for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 15 seconds. His hand was still on that second beer bottle, knuckles white, jaw clenched so tight you could see the muscles working under his skin. Then, very slowly, he let go of the bottle. He walked out from behind the counter, past Dean, past Marcus, straight to the front window. He reached up and tore down the whites only sign. The tape made a ripping sound. A couple of people gasped. Earl walked to the trash can near the door and threw the sign away. Then he turned around, and his face was wet with tears. I'm sorry, he said, and his voice cracked. I'm sorry for that sign. I'm sorry for turning people away. I'm sorry for being the kind of man who needed a stranger to tell him he was wrong. The diner was completely silent. Dean stood up from the stool and walked over to Earl. He put his hand on the man's shoulder. That's the bravest thing I've seen all week, Dean said quietly. And I've worked with some pretty brave people. Earl wiped his eyes with his apron. I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I know how to change. You start by serving my friend a beer, Dean said. And then you keep going, one day at a time, one customer at a time. You'll figure it out. Earl nodded. He walked back behind the counter, picked up the second Schlitz, and carried it over to where Marcus was still standing by the door. He held it out. I apologize, sir, Earl said. This is for you. On the house. Marcus looked at Dean. Dean nodded. Marcus took the beer. Thank you, Marcus said quietly. Earl went back behind the counter and poured himself a glass of water. His hands were still shaking. The woman with the paperback started clapping, slow at first, then faster. A couple of the men joined in. It wasn't a standing ovation, but it was something. It was a room full of people acknowledging that something had just changed. Dean and Marcus sat down at the counter. Earl brought them both menus, and they ordered burgers and fries. While they waited for the food, a couple of the customers came over to shake Dean's hand, ask for autographs. One man, a farmer in overalls, pulled Dean aside and said, I'm glad you did that. I never liked that sign, but I didn't have the guts to say anything. Dean just smiled. You're saying something now. That counts. They ate their burgers in relative quiet. The food was simple but good. The kind of honest cooking you get in places where people don't have time to get fancy. When they were finished, Dean pulled out his wallet and put a $20 bill on the counter. Earl tried to wave it away. No charge, Mr. Martin. After what you did, take the money, Earl, Dean said. You run a business. I'm a customer. That's how this works. Earl took the 20 and made change. Dean left the change as a tip. Before they left, Dean turned back to Earl one more time. I'm gonna be back this way in a few months. I'm gonna stop in and see how you're doing. You gonna be okay with that? Earl nodded. I'd like that. Good. Because I'm gonna hold you to this, Earl. You took that sign down in front of all these people. That means something. Don't put it back up. I won't. Dean and Marcus walked out into the afternoon heat. The Lincoln's engine had cooled down enough to drive. They got in the car, pulled out of the gravel lot, and headed back toward the highway. Marcus was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, You didn't have to do that. Yeah, I did, Dean said. Why? Dean thought about it for a moment. Because I was thirsty, and you were thirsty, and there was a place that sold cold beer, and the only thing standing between us and that beer was a stupid rule that never made sense in the first place. Marcus smiled. Just a little. You think he'll really keep it down? That sign? I think he will, Dean said. At least for a while. And maybe a while is long enough. Marcus looked out the window at the passing trees, and for the first time in 3 years, he understood exactly what made Dean Martin choose his battles. It wasn't about the size of the fight, or the importance of the principle. It was simpler than that. Dean fought when someone needed him to. When walking away would mean leaving someone behind. Marcus had wondered what hill Dean would die on. Turns out, it was any hill where a man was being told he didn't deserve a cold drink on a hot day. Now here's the part of the story that most people don't know, because Dean Martin never talked about it publicly. Over the next 5 years, Dean made it a point to stop at Miller's Rest Stop whenever he was driving through that part of Alabama. Sometimes he'd call ahead, sometimes he'd just show up, and every time he'd order the same thing: 2 beers, 2 burgers. And every time, Earl Miller served him with a smile. Notice something about the way change actually works in the real world, because it's not like the movies. Earl Miller didn't wake up the next morning as a completely different man. He struggled with it. He had customers who stopped coming because he'd taken down that sign. He had neighbors who called him a traitor. But every time Dean Martin walked through that door and sat down at that counter like it was the most natural thing in the world, it got a little bit easier for Earl to remember why he'd made the choice in the first place. By 1968, Earl had hired his first black employee, a young man named Raymond who worked the grill. By 1970, the customer base at Miller's Rest Stop was about as integrated as any place in rural Alabama. People came from all over the county, black and white, sitting side by side at the counter, eating the same food, drinking the same beer. Earl Miller became a different man. He started going to church again, joined a community group that worked on race relations in the county. He told his children and grandchildren the story of the day Dean Martin walked into his diner dozens of times. It became the defining moment of his life. In 1979, Earl Miller had a heart attack. He survived, but the doctors told him he needed to slow down, take it easy. He sold the diner to Raymond, the young man he'd hired all those years ago, and moved to Florida to live with his daughter. Before he left, he wrote a letter to Dean Martin. In it, he said, "You knocked some sense into me without throwing a punch. You taught me that strength isn't about hate or fear. It's about having the courage to admit you're wrong and the will to be better. That lunch I served you and Marcus in 1966 was the proudest meal I ever made." Dean kept that letter in a drawer in his study until the day he died. When Earl Miller passed away in 1985, his family called Dean to let him know. They said Earl's final wish was for Dean to know that he'd died a better man than he'd been born, and that was because of one 10-minute conversation at a lunch counter on a hot April afternoon. The building that used to house Miller's Rest Stop is still standing. It's a community center now, a place where people from all over the county come together for meetings, potlucks, voter registration drives, and on the wall there's a small brass plaque that reads, "On this site in 1966, Dean Martin reminded us that change doesn't require violence. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to ask the right questions." If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think, because the truth is, Dean Martin could have driven past that diner. He could have found another place, another road, another way to avoid the confrontation. But he didn't. He walked in, he sat down, and he had a conversation. Not a fight, not a lecture. Just a conversation between 2 men about what kind of world they wanted to live in. And in the end, that conversation changed everything. Not just for Earl Miller, but for every person who walked into that diner after that day and found a place where they were welcome regardless of the color of their skin. That's the kind of victory that matters. Not the kind you win with your fists, but the kind you win with your words, your patience, and your unshakable belief that people can be better than they are. Dean Martin showed us that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to leave. Refuse to accept the world as it is. Refuse to let someone else's fear or hatred dictate who gets a seat at the table. If you want to hear what really happened the night Dean had to make that same choice on national television, tell me in the comments.